And now we get the opportunity to address some of these great questions that are coming in. So I encourage everyone to continue adding your questions, um, and we can have a lively panel discussion. So far today, we have heard from the science side of climate adaptation and mitigation, specifically thinking a lot about the importance and value of a perennial cropping system. We've talked about the policy of climate adaptation and mitigation, and certain legislation that's coming out. And finally, we've talked about sort of what's happening on the ground, how are farmers reacting to all of this, and how is it affecting the decisions that we're making. So I want to thank everyone who's asked questions, and now I want to sort of turn to the panel and start with I'll start with the first question that we received from Kent Bradford. This was directed to Tim Cruz from the Land Institute, and the question is, with the for the perennial grasses to achieve grain yields that will be economic for the grower. And so I want to take this as a chance for Tim to weigh in on this, but also I would love to see what Meredith might have to say about, how sort of the economics of these kind of decisions of taking of a, what is the tipping point to get a farmer? How do we actually convince a farmer to adopt something like a perennial agricultural system? And then maybe even Aria, if you want to weigh in and think about, you mentioned in your talk about the sort of challenges of quantifying and valuing soil carbon. And so thinking about how these different things interact with each other would be great. So maybe Tim, you can start us off by just sort of directly addressing the question about the effect of perennial grasses on yield.
Sure. Thank you for that question. And it's an important one. We often think about the trade-offs that are made by an annual plant going either to seed or to roots. And I think that what is an important exception to make with respect to annuals is that perennials have much longer growing seasons. Here in Kansas, winter wheat is harvested in the third week of June. And that soil, that if it's weed on weed, has been bare until it's even planted yet right now. That's a lot of potential photosynthesis that has not taken place. And that's typical in annual cropping systems where either the ground is bare or there's small seedlings to growing seedlings a good portion of the year. And so in perennial cropping arrangements, you have a larger pie of photosynthesis to work with. A smaller fraction of that larger pie goes to seed because you are allocating more to roots, as the question suggested. But in all of our work and in the actual proof of the concept in China, I mentioned the perennial rice. I misspoke on the talk and said it'd been going for 6 years. It's actually been going for 3 years, 6 harvests total, but coming very close, if not actually matching the yields of annual rice. And that is a proof of concept. In new domestication species like Kernza, which have only been in the pipeline for a couple of decades, we wouldn't expect those yields to match a crop that has been in the pipeline for 10,000 years, or like wheat. And certainly the amount of scientific improvement that's happened in the last 100 years with wheat. It gives us a pretty high bar to reach, but with modern breeding tools, we should be able to get there much sooner, meaning in decades, than it took to develop the crops we currently rely on.
And Meredith, I'd love to, so what do you think? So when farmers are making these kind of decisions, like they're going to choose to adopt a new cropping system, are they just looking at the sort of bottom line, or do you feel like there are folks who are actually, interested in the impact that they're having on the environment for the value of that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, our data definitely suggests that economics and yield are important. I mean, that's how farmers are making a livelihood. So any potential yield impact is going to be something that is important to consider. But they're certainly concerned about other things as well, environmental impacts, community impacts, benefits that might be accrued by other outcomes. So I think the key issue here is how do you bridge that gap potentially, right? So if we're a few years off from a perennial crop being able to yield as much as a current crop option, are there companies or other policies or programs that can help bridge that gap for them in terms of the economic outcome that they might get. So if they're being paid for ecosystem services by adopting that, in an ideal world, that payment for ecosystem services is at least covering that potential yield gap that they might be losing, and also hopefully providing some additional benefits as well. So I think it's important we think about the economics, but I think we have a lot of options that might help us overcome that until Tim's great research helps us have comparable yields.
And so, Aria, do you feel like this is happening at the policy level? There are initiatives coming out that are going to help try to cover that gap and make up for the cost through some kind of reimbursement for ecosystem services.
Well, this is maybe a more general conversation rather than a how will policy save us response. But I think I can see in the movement that there is an increasing focus or encouraging folks to look at profitability as well as yield, as well as those longer term benefits and the reduced costs of inputs, even if yield doesn't necessarily match. Although I think we're also starting to see organic systems are another set of production that is scrutinized as much as perennial ability, even if yield takes an initial dip. And then one thing that we really see, because there is a constant call for the economic case studies, and I think the problem with the evidence that we have thus far is that it's just that it's at the case study level rather than across enough farms, enough fields to really show the statistical and empirical connection between improved resilience and either improved profitability or increased yield. And that's what we're hoping to do with our risk mitigation model is draw enough data so that you can have not just a value line decision or a case study level decision, but entire institutions beginning to assess and even price and reward risk accordingly.
Okay. Yep. So I just want to take this as a chance to tell everyone who's participating, if you don't have a direct question in mind per se, you can still open the Q&A box and you can use the little thumbs up symbol to suggest a question that you really want to hear answered. And so I'm actually going to go to the question right now that has the most thumbs up. And this question is, I guess this is probably a question most relevant for Meredith. And the question is, what would be appropriate tools to close the trust gap between farmers and researchers from academia and government, and what is industry doing better in this area? So I guess, why is it that farmers seem to trust industry more than these other sources?
I'm sure all of the panelists have some thoughts on that. Actually, evidence shows from farmers that they do trust scientists, first of all. So they trust us slightly less than they trust farmer groups and industry groups, but they do trust us more than the government. So that's reassuring, I suppose. So I think there's a role for scientists to play in these conversations as well. I mean, I think what industry is doing well right now, and why they are more trusted by farmers is first of all, farmers have a longstanding relationship with them, and for many farmers, their relationship with the government is purely regulatory, and so they know government as sort of like Big Brother, as the person they have to report to, as the person to be afraid of because they may be in non-compliance for something. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, especially as we think about voluntary programs within existing frameworks that Aria has talked about within the Farm Bill, to try to bridge those gaps in that way, to approach farmers and government to approach farmers and other people to approach farmers, not from the standpoint of, I think you're doing something wrong, I want to regulate you, or not meeting them eye to eye, but really saying, hey, there's great opportunity to improve your payment for ecosystem services, your contributions, and improving your contributions to ecosystems and to the environment, and not being regulated for it. And so obviously lots of USDA employees do that currently and work with NRCS and FSA. And, a lot of farmers work very directly with FSA, the Farm Service Agency, but work maybe less so with NRCS, who implements many of these programs. So I do think that we have to be careful too, when we talk about the government and farmer distrust of government. There are different levels of that depending on how familiar a farmer may or may not be with a particular agency. And so maybe starting with the ones they know more, like the Farm Service Agency, for example, that they might interact with for crop insurance payments and other programs that they regularly participate in, would be, in my perspective, a good starting place. But I'm sure Aria might have some thoughts on this too.
Thanks, Meredith. That was really well said. I would definitely emphasize your point about voluntary ways to participate with government. I mean, it's a big barrier to get over, but wherever we can have that relationship should be by invitation, I think is always incredibly helpful. And as I mentioned in my talk, and as you're suggesting there, relationships that are already in place, whether it's a lender or a private lender or the FSA, having those agencies start to recognize and incentivize soil health would be extremely helpful in driving adoption. And then I also just wanted to mention the aspect of training the trainer. I think some of the heartache that we've and frustration that we've heard from farmers across the country is the case of these pioneering farmers often kind of outstripping the knowledge of their local NRCS officer, and that can feel a little frustrating when the farmer who's some of the way in is still the expert. So there's a real need for, I think, both across NRCS offices and the local conservation districts and the extension agencies to increase the training and the understanding of soil and biology. And then a positive example, and one that I think is really interesting, is in South Dakota, the NRCS state conservationist, so that the head of the office of that Jeff Zimprich, is a wonderful champion of soil health, and there's over 50% of the acreage has some adoption of soil health practices, whether it's no-till or cover cropping. And so you do see that where there's leadership in NRCS at the state and district level, that does kind of trickle down.
I don't know, Tim, do you have anything you want to know? It's interesting. So you've had farmers growing Kernza. How was that? What was it that took them to convince them to start growing this?
I think a critical thing is that they weren't convinced to grow it on all of their land. So farmers who are interested in innovating will often try things on some portion of their land. And so, yeah, I mean, like all types of people, there are early adopters and farmers with a great deal of curiosity, and they're typically driven by some environmental ethic motivation for either just prevent soil erosion, but soil health is definitely one of the driving impetus for planting perennial grain crops. Mm-hmm. And yes, but we have SARE grants, and I think getting out on the ground, private industry has done a great job of people, boots on the ground, and researchers, academics don't get out nearly as much. And I think that the NRCS folks and other extension people are stressed in terms of how many there are and the areas they cover and what they're expected to deliver. And so industry kind of narrows the frame of what they're delivering, but they do it pretty well.
Okay, so I want to go to another popular question. The question is, how can we include the consumers by informing their purchasing practices? Are farmers who use healthy soil practices and initiatives marketed or highlighted at that end of the chain? So, not just the supply side, but the demand side. How do we get consumers in on this effort? So, I will leave this open. Whoever wants to answer this.
I can start us off. I think that we will see a whole host of people join the space. We've first seen people kind of poke their heads in and get really excited because of the climate benefits. And I think the next wave of people to join this movement are those who are really interested in the nutrition density benefits. So I think wherever we can make the connection between the gut microbiome and soil microbiome will and increase the research and availability of that information to the general public will vastly increase the interest and demand for these kinds of farming practices. And then, of course, there are the certifications that are in development that can help communicate that information to the consumer. Of course, in my opinion, it doesn't replace having a relationship with your farmer, but the work of the regenerative organic certification with the Rodale Institute and Dr. Barnes in Patagonia is a very kind of high bar, North Star for very active and concerned consumers. And then there's also some really interesting work out of the Savory Institute with their ecological outcomes verification and then land to market program. And that's starting to bring in fiber and meats, which is exciting work.
I would just add there, I may be a little bit of a naysayer here, but I do think we have to acknowledge that there's only a certain segment of consumers who purchase based on certifications and labels and even have the capacity to pay for something that may be more expensive. A lot of my research is also in food security, so I'm always sensitive to these conversations. So I absolutely think there's a role to be played for certification, but I actually find some of the industry efforts to be more exciting to me, honestly. You know, like Bayer now announcing that they're going to start paying farmers for cover crop adoption. Some of these things that may not even lead to down the road a marketable or a label for people to see, but are just happening across the supply chain. And embedded within sort of an industry's approach to sustainability actually may allow for, you know, things to be on the shelf that people wouldn't even know necessarily were produced in that way. And I think we probably need both. I think there's a segment of the population that certainly wants to look for labels and pay for them. But I would also love to see that food available to everyone through industry efforts or other efforts that that allow the whole sort of supply chain to be improved.
Okay, we have time for one last question, I think. And this question is another popular question it's directed to, there might be other, I think everyone can probably weigh in to a certain extent. So the question is, it's great to see developing models on GHG tool. Where do you see specialty crops, primary crops of California fit into the modeling? Will it work for crops such as leafy green, orchards, et cetera? And do you have the data you need, and do you have the remote sensing patterns you need? So we might also sort of think about this broadly to everyone. You know, there's a lot of diversity of crops. And so Aria, you can weigh in on this question, but perhaps Tim, you could say something about, you know, you've talked about rice and wheat, but do you think there's other opportunities for perenniality in other cropping systems as well? So Aria, you can start, and then we'll wrap up with this being our final question. So.
Sure, thank you. It's a great question. We do have the technology that we need in terms of the remote sensing capability to detect practices. And I've been a firm advocate of outcomes-based approach to soil health and physical soil health testing. And yet I'm really pleased to see the kind of leaps and bounds that are being made in the realm of spatial observations. So that piece is there. However, for our model in particular, we do also need yield estimations. And so that field level yield data verified wherever possible is the piece that we're still looking for in order to meet our goals of spreading beyond row crops in the Midwest and to make that available both for pasture lands as well as for specialty crops and orchard type operations in California. And I'll leave it at that. I guess I can add we're actively welcoming any input on that data. If anyone would like to reach out, we'd be happy to have that conversation.
Yeah, and I guess I would just follow by specifically around perennial crops in California. There are many. California probably has more than any other state in terms of almonds and grapes and olives and alfalfa and many fruits as well. And there was a question in the list about the degree to which those can achieve some of the same eco-services or soil health benefits as the types of perennial grain crops I was describing. And I would say they certainly can. And it really is a function of the cropping system that is developed. I've seen, you know, dry mulch, just pulverized soils under almond groves in California to save water. But it is about as destructive to the soil as any tillage anywhere. And there just happens to be almond trees growing in that field. So there's work to be done. on developing the cropping systems in those perennials, but absolutely, they don't have to be just herbaceous, non-woody plants. In fact, there's going to be places where woody plants are much more appropriate in terms of developing a natural systems inspired agriculture.
Mhm. And Meredith, I'm curious to know if you have sort of sensed differences among farmers depending on their level of, their behaviors and their sort of acceptance of things like climate change. Do you feel like there's differences between farmers who are growing one crop versus another?
Yeah, we've done some of that analysis. Actually, the one group of farmers that we found sort of consistently seem to have higher climate change belief and acknowledgement of the issue are wine grape growers. And in part, I think because of the temperature sensitivity of a lot of wine grapes, they've been sort of like an early indicator of climate change in a lot of areas. And my dissertation work that was both in California was also in New Zealand. So I had the hard job of, talking to wine grape growers and drinking some New Zealand wine. But in our experience, wine grape growers have been thinking about this, especially from that temperature sensitivity perspective, for a long time.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, we can't all applaud, but if everyone was there, we'd all be applauding for our panelists. Thank you for the wonderful talks and the nice discussion. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of today's session, but I want to just sort of take an opportunity to remind everyone about the upcoming sessions that are happening. So this is a month-long event. We're going to have the same time every Wednesday of the month of October. So we'd love to see you back here next week. We're going to be talking about climate risks interactions, so interactions between different types of climate risks. And this will be a great session with these wonderful speakers here. That'll be on October 14th at the same time. And then the next week, on the 21st, we're going to be sort of focusing again on pursuing climate resilience, another wonderful list of speakers. And we'd love to see everybody registered and joining for this event as well. And then our last session on October 28th is focusing on developing a more equitable agricultural systems. And we have a wonderful lineup of speakers. So we encourage you to go to the website for this event and make sure you register for all of these future events. And again, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to have this conversation and hear from these great folks. So thank you.